I've just bought this GT3 RS because Porsche have refused to fix it.
From the outside, this GT3 RS looks immaculate.
Who can say no to a GT3?
Porsche said no. Not we'll look at it. Not let us think it over, but a flat, final no. A GT3 RS, one of the most desired sports cars in the world, sat with a dead engine while the very company that built it turned its back and refused to honor the warranty. That single decision turned a car worth well over £100,000 into something the previous owner could no longer afford to fix, could no longer drive, and eventually could no longer keep. It ended up at a repossession auction, sold for a fraction of its true value, looking flawless on the outside while hiding a total mystery underneath the engine cover. This is a story of buying that car, tearing it apart piece by piece, chasing clue after clue, and trying to force Porsche to change his mind. It is a story about stubborn detective work, expensive mistakes, small wins that quietly turn into new problems, and one tiny part fitted the wrong way round that caused weeks of confusion. If you've ever wondered what really goes on when a supercar goes badly wrong, or why a manufacturer might walk away from a car it proudly built, this is about as close as you can get to watching it happen in real time, mistake by mistake, part by part. From the outside, nobody would have guessed anything was wrong at all. The paint had been protected with a special film. The interior looked barely touched, and the car had clearly been loved and cared for by somebody who paid attention to small details. Every panel lined up, every trim piece sat exactly where it should, and even the roll cage inside had been carefully wrapped rather than left bare. But looks can lie, and this GT3 RS was about to prove that in the most expensive and most frustrating way possible, hiding a fault so strange that even calling Porsche directly would not fully explain it until much later in the story. What makes this tale worth telling is not just the size of the bill or the badge on the back of the car, but the sheer number of times the fix seemed finished, only for the engine to prove otherwise the very next time it was started. Anyone who has ever fixed anything complicated knows that feeling of false victory, that moment where you believe the job is done, only to be handed a fresh problem seconds later. This story has that feeling stretched out across weeks, not minutes, with real money and a real supercar riding on every single guess. It is also a useful reminder for anyone who has ever assumed that a shiny, well-kept exterior automatically means a healthy machine underneath, because in this case the two things had almost nothing to do with each other. The paintwork told a story of careful ownership and pride, while the engine bay told a completely different story of neglect, secrecy, and a repair job abandoned halfway through by people who should have known better. Keeping both of those stories in mind at the same time is exactly what made this project so unpredictable from start to finish. Before getting into repair itself, it helps to understand exactly what made this car so special and so risky to buy at the very same time. The GT3 RS is Porsche's track-focused version of the famous 911, built with a bigger rear wing, a lighter body built from special materials, and an engine tuned to rev harder and scream louder than almost anything else the company makes. Cars like this usually come with a full manufacturer warranty, meaning nearly anything that goes wrong gets repaired by Porsche completely free of charge, no matter how expensive the part or how many hours of skilled labor the job takes. That warranty is often worth far more than most people realize, because serious engine work on a car like this can easily run into the tens of thousands of pounds, especially when specialist parts and specialist tools are involved. So when the previous owner took the car to Porsche with an engine problem, fully expecting it to be covered like any other warranty repair, the shock of being told the cover was void must have been huge and completely unexpected. Without that safety net, the repair bill suddenly became something the owner simply could not afford to pay out of pocket. Payments on the car's finance agreement stopped soon after. The finance company reclaimed the vehicle, and it ended up at a repossession auction. The kind of sale where cars move quickly and buyers are given very little background information to work from. Whoever bought this car walked away with almost nothing solid to go on beyond the simple fact that it did not run, and that Porsche itself had already looked at it and walked away. That is an enormous gamble to take, because a phrase "does not run" can mean anything from a 50-pound fix to a 50,000-pound total rebuild, and there is rarely any real way to know which one you are dealing with until the car is already sitting in your own workshop and the money has already left your bank account. This particular purchase was made purely on a belief that the pristine outside condition meant somebody genuinely cared for this car, and that whatever had killed the engine could realistically be found and fixed for far less than the huge gap between a low auction price and the car's true market value. In every real sense, it was a bet placed with real money on a car nobody fully understood yet. Buying cars this way is a strategy built entirely around confidence in the details you can see, paired with a calculated guess about the details you cannot. A car covered in scratches, dents, and mismatched paint tells you it has probably lived a hard life mechanically too. A car this clean, this cared for, sent the opposite signal, suggesting an owner who serviced on time, avoided track abuse, and treated the machine with respect right up until the moment the engine let them down. That signal is never a guarantee, but it is often the only piece of real evidence available before the wrenches even come out, and was the entire reason this particular gamble felt worth taking in the first place. The very first job was simply to find out how bad things really were, because every decision after that depended entirely on the answer. Turning the key in the ignition showed that the starter motor was still spinning the engine over, which was actually a genuinely good early sign, since a badly seized or catastrophically damaged engine will often refuse to turn at all, no matter how much power reaches a starter. With that small piece of relief, the car was lifted up on a ramp so the underside could be properly inspected for anything obviously wrong before any panels were removed. What showed up first was oil, and a lot of it, sitting thick and dark in a pool on the floor directly beneath the engine. At first glance, this looked like a serious leak, possibly even something directly connected to whatever had killed the engine in the first place. But a closer, more careful look told a slightly different story. Some plugs, the bolts that seal the bottom of the engine and allow old oil to drain out safely during a routine service, were sitting loose, only finger tight, clearly never properly torqued down using a proper tool. That kind of thing does not happen by pure accident. It happens when somebody has already been working inside this exact engine, draining the oil out for some reason, and then put the plugs back in without bothering to tighten them properly afterward. This became the very first clue that Porsche, or somebody working closely with them, had already been inside this car before it ever reached the auction house. Removing both plugs completely showed there was hardly any oil left inside the engine at all, which raised an obvious and slightly worrying question. Had this car been run at some point without enough oil inside it? And could that be exactly what destroyed the engine in the first place? Alongside the mystery of the missing oil came a second odd discovery nearby. On one of the front suspension arms, a nut that should have been securely fitted to hold a long bolt firmly in place was completely missing, with no usable thread left behind to grip onto at all. A car simply cannot be driven safely on public roads with a bolt like that hanging loose and unsecured, which meant somebody had also been taking the front suspension apart, for reasons that were still nowhere near clear at this early stage. None of this fully explained why the engine refused to start properly, but it was slowly building a much clearer picture of a car that had been stripped down, worked on in several different places, and then rushed back together carelessly, long before it ever reached the auction floor. Every mechanic knows that a car rarely lies about its own history, if you know where to look, and these two small clues, the loose plugs and the missing suspension nut, were both quiet confessions that somebody else had already been here first. The real question was no longer whether the car had secrets. It clearly did. The real question was how many more of those secrets were waiting to be uncovered, and whether any of them would turn out to be small annoyances or genuine deal breakers capable of turning this bargain into a very expensive mistake. With no obvious answer sitting on the surface, the next logical step was to dig further into the engine itself. Start with the parts they're easiest and quickest to reach. All 6 spark plugs were carefully removed one at a time, since a badly fouled or physically damaged plug can sometimes point straight toward a much bigger problem happening deep inside a particular cylinder. Every single plug came out looking noticeably wet, but otherwise reasonably normal, with no smashed electrodes and no strange colored coating that would usually suggest a serious mechanical failure lurking underneath. A small inspection camera was then carefully pushed down through each empty spark plug hole to look directly inside every cylinder, checking closely for scoring, scratches, or visible damage along the piston and cylinder walls. 5 of the 6 cylinders looked completely fine and healthy under close inspection. The 6th showed a small trace of oil that seemed to be slowly creeping past the piston rings, which was certainly worth noting for later, but was not dramatic enough on its own to fully explain a car that refused to start at all, even with a fresh battery. At this point, a simple but genuinely clever test was tried out. With no spark plugs fitted at all, there's no compression building up inside any of the cylinders, which makes a whole engine far easier to spin over freely, either by hand or using the electric starter motor. Fresh engine oil was poured in, all 7.5 liters that this particular engine required, and a brand new genuine Porsche battery was fitted to remove any lingering doubt about whether the old flat battery had simply been hiding a much simpler explanation the entire time. The engine was cranked again, and this time it spun over freely and sounded genuinely strong, with no unusual knocking noises and no fresh oil leaking out anywhere underneath. It was a real moment of excitement in the workshop, because for a few short minutes it truly looked like the whole fix might have been as simple as a flat battery combined with a couple of loose unplugs. The spark plugs were carefully cleaned and refitted, and the engine was cranked once again, but this time it would only catch briefly before immediately dying again, refusing to properly fire up and run on its own. Whatever was wrong clearly went much deeper than a simple flat battery, and it was time to check whether the engine was even receiving any fuel at all in the first place. That brief moment of success, hearing the engine spin freely with no spark plugs fitted, was genuinely important even though it did not solve the whole puzzle, because it ruled out a whole category of expensive possibilities in one single test. A seized crankshaft, a bent connecting rod, or a badly damaged bottom end would never have allowed the engine to turn over that smoothly and that easily, no matter how fresh the oil or how strong the new battery. So while the celebration was premature, the underlying confidence that this engine could still be saved was growing stronger with every small test completed. There's a particular kind of relief that comes from ruling out the worst possible outcome, even before the actual problem has been found, because it changes the entire mood of a job from damage control into genuine problem solving. Instead of quietly preparing for the news that the whole engine needed scrapping, the team could now focus fully on tracking down whatever smaller, more specific fault was still hiding somewhere inside a system that had already proven it could physically spin, compress, and hold oil pressure without falling apart. That question ended up leading to one of the strangest single discoveries of the entire job. Sitting loose on the passenger seat when the car was first collected from the auction was a single small electrical fuse, completely unconnected to anything, and just rattling around inside the cabin. At first, it did not seem important at all, but with the engine still refusing to run properly, it seemed worth checking exactly where that particular fuse actually belonged inside the car's electrical system. A careful check of the fuse box diagram showed one specific slot sitting completely empty, and a tiny label printed right next to it read fuel pump relay. Without that fuse fitted in its correct place, the electric fuel pump has absolutely no power at all, meaning the engine receives no fuel whatsoever, which alone would easily stop it from running properly no matter what else had already been fixed elsewhere. The fuse was carefully pushed back into its correct empty slot, and the engine was cranked once again. This time it caught almost instantly and kept running steadily, filling the entire workshop with the strong smell of raw fuel and the genuine sound of an engine finally alive again, even though it clearly did not sound completely healthy just yet. A warning light on the dashboard was flashing rapidly, and the engine had a rough, uneven, stumbling note that strongly suggested a misfire, meaning one or more cylinders were simply not firing correctly at the right moment. A diagnostic computer was quickly plugged in to read whatever fault codes were currently stored inside the car's onboard computer, and it confirmed a genuinely serious problem, showing that an entire bank of 3-hole cylinders was misfiring badly, and that the sensors monitoring the camshafts on that particular side of the engine were reporting a short-circuit fault. A quick look at the exhaust system confirmed it too, since only one side of the dual exhaust was getting properly hot, meaning the other 3 cylinders were doing almost no useful work at all. A compression test was carried out next, carefully checking exactly how much pressure each individual cylinder could build up during its own compression stroke. Strangely, every single cylinder still showed some usable compression, even the ones that were clearly not firing at all, which did not immediately make obvious sense and pointed strongly towards something unusual happening with the way the valves themselves were opening and closing, rather than a simple mechanical failure like a cracked piston or a hole burned straight through the block. This particular result actually mattered a great deal, because a total loss of compression on 3 cylinders would usually mean a badly worn engine bottom end, Something that could easily push the entire repair bill past the point where fixing the car made any financial sense at all. Finding real, usable pressure in every cylinder, even the misfiring ones, was quietly one of the most reassuring results of the whole early investigation. Even though nobody in the workshop fully understood yet exactly why it was happening. It was one of those strange situations where good news and confusion arrived together in the same breath. Since a healthy compression reading normally means good news on its own, but here it simply did not line up neatly with 3 cylinders that were clearly refusing to fire at all. That mismatch, more than any single fault code, was the real signal that something unusual and mechanical, rather than something electrical, was waiting to be discovered once the engine was finally opened up properly. Chasing that stubborn misfire eventually meant making a fairly drastic decision, pulling the entire engine completely out of the car, so it could finally be stripped down properly for a thorough internal inspection. Before reaching that decision, sparking was carefully tested directly at each individual spark plug, and every single one produced a strong, healthy, visible spark, which comfortably ruled out any kind of straightforward ignition system problem. That left the camshaft position sensors and the internal timing itself as the 2 most likely remaining suspects, especially since one entire side of the engine only seemed to start firing properly once the healthy side had already got the whole engine running smoothly, almost as if that troubled side was silently waiting for a signal it was simply never going to receive correctly on its own. Removing the rocker cover, the metal cover that sits neatly on top of the cylinder head protecting the camshafts and the whole valve mechanism underneath, revealed the real underlying problem almost immediately. On one entire side of the engine, small metal arms known as finger followers were completely missing from where they should have been fitted. These small but vital parts sit directly between the rotating camshaft lobes and the valve springs below, and their entire job is to transfer the smooth rotating motion of the spinning camshaft into the up and down motion needed to properly open and close each individual valve. Without them correctly fitted in place, the camshaft can happily spin round and round forever without ever actually opening a single valve at all, which neatly explained both persistent misfire and the strange, unusually consistent compression readings recorded earlier, since valves that genuinely never open at all naturally create trapped, oddly steady pressure inside each affected cylinder. It eventually turned out that these exact finger followers were already a well-known weak point on this particular generation of GT3 RS engine, made from a material that wore down noticeably faster than it reasonably should, eventually failing completely under normal use. Whoever had previously worked on this engine clearly already knew about this specific problem, since the worn parts had already been fully removed at some point, but for reasons still completely unexplained at this stage, they had simply never been properly replaced before the whole engine was reassembled and quietly handed back to the customer. Seeing an empty space where an important part should have been sitting is one of the strangest feelings of mechanical work, because it removes all doubt in an instant. There is no ambiguity left to argue over, no borderline where pattern that could be read 2 different ways. Either the part is there or it is not. And in this case, it clearly was not, which meant the mystery of the misfire had finally been cracked, even though the mystery of why nobody had bothered to fix it properly the first time remained completely open. It also raised an uncomfortable thought that lingered over the rest of the rebuild. If a known weak point like this had simply been left unfinished rather than properly repaired, what other shortcuts might be hiding elsewhere in the engine, quietly waiting to cause the next unexpected problem further down the line? That thought alone was reason enough to check absolutely everything twice rather than trust that any part of this engine was exactly as it should be. That single discovery also neatly solved another small mystery noticed much earlier on. The strangely loose bolts found sitting on the camshaft variators. The sprocket-like components fitted at the very end of each camshaft that carefully control variable valve timing, constantly adjusting exactly when each valve opens and closes depending on how hard the engine is currently being driven. To properly remove the worn finger followers in the first place, a mechanic genuinely has no choice but to take the camshafts fully out first, and taking the camshafts out necessarily means loosening those particular variator bolts along the way. Somebody had clearly done exactly that at some earlier point, removing the worn parts purely to inspect them closely, and then simply never finished the job properly afterward, leaving the variators sitting loose and the finger followers missing entirely rather than being carefully replaced with genuine new ones. A closer inspection of the camshaft lobes themselves, the oval-shaped bumps that physically push against each finger follower to force a valve open, revealed clearly visible flat spots forming where smooth, evenly rounded metal should normally have been. This particular wear pattern was described as a genuinely known issue directly linked to exactly how oil naturally reaches that specific part of the engine, causing certain precise points along the cam lobe to run noticeably drier than others and wear down considerably faster as a direct result over time. With obvious flat spots forming instead of smooth curves, the valves simply cannot open as far or as smoothly as they were originally designed to, which naturally causes exactly the kind of stubborn misfire and rough running already seen earlier, especially once the engine is revved much harder and the valves genuinely need to move a lot more air in and out quickly. Brand new camshafts and brand new finger followers, this time thankfully made from an upgraded and hopefully far longer lasting material, were carefully ordered for both sides of the engine to properly fix the underlying problem, rather than simply patching around it temporarily. While placing that particular part's order directly with Porsche over the phone, something genuinely important finally came to light. The actual real reason Porsche had originally refused to honor the warranty in the first place. Their internal diagnostic system apparently showed that during the previous year of ownership, the engine had run for around 30 separate hours, yet only covered a tiny total distance during all of that running time, averaging out at just over 1 single mile per hour of actual running. An extremely unusual pattern that strongly suggested the car's recorded mileage might have been deliberately tampered with using some kind of mileage blocking device. Something Porsche was simply not willing to quietly overlook or ignore. Suddenly, the whole warranty refusal made a lot more sense. From Porsche's side of the desk, a car showing worn parts that did not match the mileage on the dashboard looks exactly like fraud, and no manufacturer wants to spend tens of thousands of pounds repairing an engine under warranty if the numbers on the clock cannot be trusted. It was frustrating to hear, but it finally explained a decision that had seemed completely unreasonable right up until that phone call. Rebuilding a modern flat-six engine correctly is an incredibly precise, genuinely unforgiving job, and every single step along the way has to be carried out exactly to the manufacturer's official specification, especially anything relating to internal timing. The new camshafts and finger followers were carefully fitted first on the more heavily damaged side of the engine, sliding the fresh new followers neatly into place before very carefully lowering the brand new camshaft down directly on top of them. Special locking tools were needed throughout this entire process, sliding down through small dedicated holes in the cylinder head to hold each camshaft firmly in exactly the correct position while the rocker cover itself was removed and later refitted, since allowing them to spring free at the wrong moment could easily throw the whole engine's timing out completely, or even cause serious internal damage almost instantly. The variators, which grip firmly onto the very end of each camshaft using an internal clutch-style plate system, were carefully slid on and then tightened down using an exact, very specific sequence of torque and angle settings, tightening first to one precise force, then rotating a further set number of degrees, then adding a small additional amount again afterward. A careful process specifically designed to make absolutely sure the grip is tight enough that the variator can genuinely never slip out of time once the engine is fully running under real load out on the road. A special locking tool shaped almost exactly like a fork was used to properly check the finished work, since it would only physically slide over both camshafts correctly if their internal timing relationship was exactly right, giving an instant, reliable pass or fail check before the engine was ever risked being started up again. Once that side was fully confirmed correct, attention moved across to the other side of the engine, which thankfully only needed the intake camshaft and its finger followers replaced, since the exhaust side on that particular bank still looked to be in reasonably good original condition. With both sides now properly rebuilt, new spark plugs fitted as a sensible extra job, since the engine was already fully apart and genuinely due a service anyway, and the whole engine finally bolted back securely into the car. The real moment of truth had finally arrived. The engine turned over smoothly, caught almost instantly, and ran, filling the entire workshop with a loud, rough, but genuinely running exhaust note despite still having no actual exhaust system properly fitted yet. For one brief, genuinely hopeful moment, it truly seemed like the long list of problems might finally be fully solved, and that a straightforward oil change, a simple fault code clear, and one short test run would comfortably confirm the fix was finally both complete and entirely correct. Everybody in the workshop wanted to believe it too, after so many hours spent hunched over the same engine bay. And there was even a light-hearted